The dust of the Texan frontier clung to everything. It coated the longhorns, settled on the porch of the main house, and even found its way into the coffee Thomas Grant drank every morning. At 57, Thomas was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape. His face was a map of sun-worn lines, his hands calloused from decades of hard work, and his eyes held the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He was the wealthiest rancher in the region, his brand, a simple T with a flowing G, stamped on cattle from one horizon to the next. His life was one of routine and solitude. He'd lost his wife, Eleanor, to consumption 10 years prior, and his only son, Jacob, had left for California in a youthful search for gold, never to return. The sprawling Grant Ranch, a testament to his life's work, was a grand, lonely monument. He had a foreman, a dozen wranglers, and a cook, but the house itself was a cavernous, silent space. That silence was shattered one scorching afternoon when his foreman, a grizzled veteran named Hank, rode up to the main house. Hank dismounted, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust. "Boss," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we found something, or someone." Thomas set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Spit it out, Hank. Is it trouble?" "Not exactly. We were out by the Cimarron Creek checking fences. Found a wagon, broken axle. The folks, well, they were gone. But there was a boy." Thomas's brow furrowed. "A boy? What's he doing out there on his own?" "He's not talking," Hank said, scratching his chin. "Just stares at you with those big sad eyes. No kin around, far as we can tell. Looks about 10, maybe 11. Name's Ethan, according to a note we found in his satchel." A boy. The word hung in the air, stirring something long dormant within Thomas. He had no time for strays, especially not in a land where every extra mouth was a burden. Yet, the image of a silent child, alone in the wilderness, pricked at his hardened conscience. "Bring him to the bunkhouse," Thomas ordered. "Give him some food. We'll figure out what to do with him." Hank nodded and rode off. A few hours later, Thomas found himself standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse, a place he rarely visited. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and wood smoke. In a corner, hunched on a small cot, was a boy. He was thin, with matted brown hair and clothes that were too big and too dusty. His eyes, however, were what captured Thomas's attention. They were a striking, piercing blue, and they held an ancient sadness, a depth that felt out of place on a child's face. The boy, Ethan, looked up at Thomas but said nothing. The wranglers had tried to talk to him, to coax a single word, but he remained a statue of quiet despair. He ate the stew they gave him, but with a mechanical lack of interest, as if his mind were miles away. "Son," Thomas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You got a name, they tell me, Ethan, is that right?" The boy only blinked. "You've been through something bad, I reckon, but you're safe now. For a while, anyway. We'll find out where you belong." Again, silence. It wasn't a defiant silence, but a hollow, empty one. It was as if the boy had no words left to give. Thomas stood there for a long moment, the silence between them growing. He'd never been good with children, not even his own son in his final years at home. The helplessness he felt now was a bitter, unfamiliar sensation. Over the next few days, Ethan became a quiet fixture on the ranch. He didn't work, couldn't, but he followed the wranglers around like a small, lost shadow. He observed everything with those perceptive blue eyes, from the way Thomas saddled his horse to the way the cook, a stout woman named Bess, kneaded dough. He was a perfect observer, a silent sponge soaking up the world around him. The ranch hands, a rough but good-hearted bunch, took to him. They'd leave him small pieces of jerky or tell him stories about their travels, though he never responded. The cook, Bess in particular, fussed over him. She was a motherly woman who had lost her own children to illness. She'd bring him fresh-baked biscuits and talk to him, as if he were her own. "You've got to speak, little one," she'd say softly, wiping a stray flour smudge from his cheek. "It's no good keeping all that inside." But the boy remained mute. The local sheriff, a friend of Thomas's, had come by to see if the boy was known to him, but Ethan's description matched no one in his records. The consensus was that the boy's parents had likely been killed by bandits or lost to the elements. Thomas was faced with a stark reality. He was responsible for a boy who had no home, no voice, and no past he was willing to share. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and red, Thomas found Ethan sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the vast open plains. The boy's satchel, a small leather bag, rested beside him. Thomas had noticed the boy was never far from it. He sat down a few feet away, the silence between them as comfortable and immense as the landscape. "You like it out here?" Thomas asked, not expecting an answer. Ethan turned his head slowly, those deep blue eyes meeting Thomas's. A flicker of something passed through them. Not sadness, not fear, but a flicker of understanding. The boy's hand went to the satchel. He pulled out a small, worn book, its cover faded and its pages stained. He opened it, revealing not English, but a script Thomas had never seen before. It was filled with elegant, curved letters that looked like flowing water. Thomas looked from the book to the boy's face. He knew he was looking at something more than a simple book. It was a link to a world he couldn't comprehend, a world that this small, silent boy carried with him. The mystery of Ethan was just beginning to unfold, a fragile secret tucked away in the silent, vast heart of the American West. Days turned into a week, and Ethan's silence became a part of the ranch's daily rhythm. He was like a ghost, moving through the bunkhouse in the dusty yard, observing, but never participating. Thomas had made a few discreet inquiries in nearby towns, but no one had heard of a missing family with a boy matching Ethan's description. The boy was an orphan, and the harsh reality of the frontier meant that his future was bleak. Thomas knew he couldn't keep him forever. A ranch was no place to raise a child, especially a child so deeply scarred. The thought, however, brought an unexpected pang of unease. The boy's presence, though silent, had filled a small part of the cavernous emptiness in his home. One blistering afternoon, Thomas needed to head into town for supplies and to finalize the sale of a new herd. He was about to mount his horse when he saw Ethan standing near the corral, his blue eyes fixed on the grand stallion, Tempest. Thomas sighed, a puff of dry air. He didn't want to take the boy with him, but leaving him alone on the ranch felt wrong, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. "You're coming with me," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Stay close. Don't wander off." Ethan simply nodded, the first voluntary sign of assent Thomas had seen from him. The boy's satchel, as always, was slung over his shoulder. The town of Red Rock was a dusty, bustling hub of commerce and conflict. Wagons clattered down the main street. Cowboys on horseback weaved through the crowd, and the scent of fried food and stale whiskey hung in the air. The main street was lined with saloons, a general store, and the ever-present blacksmith. Thomas tied his horse outside the largest saloon, a place called the Golden Spur, known for its rowdy atmosphere and card games. He needed to meet a cattle buyer there, a man named Henderson. Ethan stayed close to Thomas's side, his small hand gripping the fabric of Thomas's duster coat. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in the spectacle of town life, the boisterous laughter, the clinking of glasses, the loud arguments spilling out of the saloons. They found Henderson at a table in the corner, a burly man with a handlebar mustache. The two men settled their business, and Thomas ordered a sarsaparilla for himself and a lemonade for the boy. While they talked, a group of 3 men entered the saloon. They were not cowboys. Their clothes were finer, their boots polished, and their faces clean-shaven. They spoke in a language Thomas didn't recognize, a rapid, musical tongue that sounded like nothing he had ever heard in the West. They sat at a nearby table and ordered drinks, their conversation growing louder. One of them, a man with a sharp, pointed face, saw Ethan and Thomas. He said something to his companions in their foreign language, and they all laughed. He then approached their table, a smug smile on his face. "Excuse me, sir," the man said in heavily accented English, "but your little mute companion there, he seems to be quite intrigued by our conversation." Thomas's hand went to the small revolver at his hip. "He's with me. And he ain't mute, he just ain't got anything to say to the likes of you." The man's smile widened. "A defense for the boy. How charming. Perhaps you would be willing to make a wager, senor. My companions and I are from Argentina. We are discussing business in our native tongue. Perhaps your little boy could tell us what we are saying?" He said the word mute again, with a mocking tone. Thomas's knuckles whitened. He wasn't a man who gambled, and he despised this man's arrogance. "The boy is a child. He don't speak, not even English. Get out of here." The man turned back to his friends and said something in Spanish. They all laughed again. It was then that a different voice, a small, clear voice, cut through the boisterous saloon noise. "No hablamos español. Los chistes sobre el silencio no son graciosos." The saloon went silent. Every eye in the room turned to the small boy. The boy, Ethan, stood straighter, his blue eyes locked on the three men. The Argentine men stared at him, their faces frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief. "¿Qué dijiste, niño?" one of them stammered, his bravado gone. "Dije que no hablamos español," Ethan repeated, his voice still small but firm. "Y que tus bromas no son graciosas." The men looked at each other and then back at Ethan, dumbfounded. The first man, the smug one, turned pale. He mumbled something in Spanish to his friends, and they quickly paid for their drinks and left the saloon, casting nervous glances back at the boy. The silence in the Golden Spur was thick. The bartender had stopped wiping glasses, the card players had frozen mid-deal, and Thomas Grant was sitting with his mouth slightly ajar, a look of utter astonishment on his face. He had heard Ethan speak. Not only speak, but speak in a foreign language. And not only one, but he had understood and responded to their Argentinian Spanish. A grizzled old cowboy named Silas, who was sitting at the bar, let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. That boy ain't mute after all." Thomas stared at Ethan. The boy's hand was still on his duster coat, but now his blue eyes held a different emotion. They were not sad or empty, but alert. He had revealed a part of himself, a part that was completely unexpected and utterly confounding. "Ethan," Thomas said, his voice a low whisper, You speak Spanish." The boy looked up at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, he spoke directly to Thomas. "No, sir, not Spanish. Argentinian. It has a different lilt." The words were spoken with a quiet confidence that belied his age. Thomas was utterly speechless. He had brought a silent, lost boy to his home, only to discover he had taken in a linguistic prodigy. This changed everything. The mystery of the boy, of his past and his true nature, had just deepened beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. What other secrets was this child hiding? The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one, but the silence was now charged with a new significance. Thomas kept glancing at Ethan, who rode a small mare next to him, his posture composed and his expression unreadable. The boy had not spoken another word since the saloon, as if he had revealed his secret and was now content to retreat back into his shell. Thomas's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. 7 languages. The boy had spoken Spanish, but what about the other 6? Where had he learned them? Why was he so reluctant to speak English or any language at all? The incident in the saloon had not just been a moment of defiance, it had been a revelation. Thomas had saved an orphan, but he had no idea he had found a walking, talking enigma. When they arrived back at the ranch, Thomas dismounted and led his horse to the stables, Ethan following closely. He handed the boy his reins. "Stable him. Give him a good brush down." Ethan looked at the horse, then at Thomas, and without a word, he began to care for the animal with an efficiency that surprised Thomas. He brushed the dust from the horse's coat with gentle, practiced strokes, and his small hands worked the saddle and bridle with surprising strength. Later that evening, Thomas found Ethan sitting on the porch again, his small, worn book in his lap. Thomas sat beside him. He needed answers. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer than usual, "in town, you spoke. You understood what those men were saying, and you knew they were from Argentina." Ethan looked up from his book. He turned a page and Thomas saw the elegant foreign script again. "It is a language called Catalan," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "From a small region in Spain. My father taught me." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. A full sentence. It was the most he had heard from the boy. "Your father, where is he?" Ethan's eyes clouded over, and he looked down at the book. He is gone. Like my mother. The bandits, they didn't care for our trade. Trade? What trade? Thomas asked, leaning forward. We were interpreters, Ethan said, his voice gaining a little more strength. My family traveled the world. My father was a linguist. He believed that language was the key to understanding all people. He taught me a new language in every country we visited. This was a story Thomas had never imagined. A traveling family of interpreters, wandering the world, teaching their child a new language at every turn. It explained the boy's fluency, but it also opened up a chasm of new questions. 7 languages, you said, Thomas prompted, his voice gentle. You know 7 languages? Ethan nodded. English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, and Arabic. My father said I had a gift for it. A good memory. Thomas was floored. English was hard enough for most people on the frontier, let alone 5 other complex tongues. This was no ordinary boy. This was a treasure, a living library of knowledge and culture. Why didn't you speak to us? Thomas asked, the most pressing question on his mind. Ethan hugged the book to his chest. My father always said words have power, and that in a new place, silence is a shield. He was afraid of people who would exploit me. He said my gift could be a curse too. He taught me to be quiet, to listen and to observe. He said it was the best way to survive. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The boy wasn't mute out of trauma. He was silent by design, by instruction. He was following his father's last lesson, the ultimate survival strategy. And the bandits? Thomas asked. Ethan's eyes welled up with tears. He shook his head, unable to speak further. The trauma was there, a deep, festering wound that had not healed. Thomas didn't press him. He understood. The boy had given him more than he had a right to ask for. A comfortable, understanding silence fell over them. Thomas looked out at the darkening plains, the setting sun painting the sky in strokes of deep purple and gold. He wasn't looking at the land as a source of wealth anymore. He was looking at it as a sanctuary, a place where a small lost boy could find a home and a voice. The burden of responsibility he had felt was now gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a wealthy rancher. He was a protector. He would use his wealth, his influence, and everything in his power to ensure this boy's secret was protected. He looked down at the book in Ethan's lap, the elegant, incomprehensible script, a tangible piece of a life he couldn't fathom. Thomas didn't know how he was going to protect this boy, or what dangers lay in wait for someone with such a unique talent. But he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't send him away. The boy was staying, and together they would face whatever the world threw at them. The morning after their long talk, the mood on the ranch was different. Ethan was no longer a silent shadow. He still spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight and purpose. Thomas had made it clear to his men that Ethan was no longer a temporary guest. He was under Thomas's protection, and his unique abilities were to be kept a secret. The men, who had grown fond of the boy, agreed without question. Hank, the foreman, took a particular liking to him, and would often find him small tasks to do, like mending saddles or helping with the horses. Ethan, in turn, worked diligently, his movements precise and intelligent. A week passed in this new routine. Thomas had begun to feel a flicker of paternal pride. He'd often find himself watching Ethan, a small, knowing smile on his face. The boy was a quick learner, and his mind, so sharp and curious, was a joy to behold. Thomas had even found himself digging out old maps and books, pointing out different countries, and discussing their cultures with the boy. Ethan would listen intently, his eyes shining with a hunger for knowledge that reminded Thomas of his own long-lost passion for reading and learning. But the peace was short-lived. One sweltering afternoon, a rider approached the ranch, his horse foaming at the mouth. He was a young man from the town, a messenger who had been sent from the local sheriff. "Mr. Grant," the boy panted, dismounting. "Sheriff Lewis sent me. He says you need to get into town. The ones from Argentina. They've been asking questions." A cold dread settled in Thomas's stomach. The smug face of the man from the saloon flashed in his mind. He had been a fool to think they would simply forget. Ethan's outburst had not just surprised them, it had piqued their interest. "What kind of questions?" Thomas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "They're asking about a boy with blue eyes who speaks foreign languages. Said they'd pay good money for information. The sheriff told them he didn't know nothing, but they're still hanging around. Said they're looking for an interpreter, a boy who can help them with some business they have here." The word interpreter hit Thomas like a physical blow. They weren't looking to exploit a child. They were looking for a tool, a weapon. They had realized the value of Ethan's gift, and they would stop at nothing to get him. "All right," Thomas said, his mind racing. "Thank you, son. Go back and tell the sheriff I'll be there." He turned and strode back to the main house. He found Ethan sitting at the table, drawing intricate patterns on a piece of parchment. The boy looked up, his blue eyes calm and questioning. "We have to go," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Now, pack what you have." Ethan didn't question him. He simply folded his drawing and put it and his worn book into his satchel. He was already at the door, ready to go. The boy's quick, quiet obedience was a stark reminder of his past and the dangers he had faced. He was used to being on the run. "Thomas," Bess, the cook, asked, wiping her hands on her apron, "what's wrong?" "Some folks in town are looking for Ethan," Thomas explained, his eyes fixed on the boy. "They're not to be trusted. We're heading for the San Fernando Ranch. It's a good ways from here, and the land is rough. No one will find us there." The San Fernando Ranch was a distant property Thomas owned, a remote and rugged land that was more suited for cattle than for people. It was perfect for hiding. They packed what they needed: food, water, ammunition, and a few essentials. Hank gathered a few of his best men, and they prepared to ride out. As they left the ranch, a sense of urgency hung in the air. Thomas knew that the men in Red Rock wouldn't give up easily. They had seen something of value, and the promise of wealth and power would make them relentless. The journey was long and arduous. They rode through the night, the vast, starry sky a blanket over them. Ethan rode beside Thomas, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. He was silent, but Thomas could feel the boy's tension. He was aware of the danger. He had lived with it his entire life. As they rode, Thomas thought about the men. Who were they? What kind of business did they need a multilingual interpreter for? The possibilities were endless, and all of them were dangerous. Smugglers, bandits, men involved in illegal trade with foreign nations. The western frontier was a lawless place, and people with unique skills like Ethan's were either protected or exploited. Thomas knew which side of that line he was on. They reached the San Fernando Ranch just as the sun was rising, a fiery orb on the horizon. The ranch was little more than a main cabin, a bunkhouse, and a corral, all in need of repair. It was isolated and perfect. "This is our home for now," Thomas said, dismounting. "No one will find us here." As they began to unload their supplies, a new rider appeared on the horizon, a single figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Thomas's hand went to his gun, and the other men did the same. The figure approached, and as he got closer, Thomas recognized him. It was Sheriff Lewis. He rode up to them, his face grim. "Thomas, we got a problem." "What is it, Sheriff?" "Those men from the saloon," the sheriff said, dismounting and looking around. "They were watching you, saw you ride out with the boy. I tried to delay 'em, but they're on their way. I didn't want 'em to find you, so I rode out here to warn you. They're on your trail, and they're not just asking questions anymore." Thomas looked from the sheriff to the horizon, where the dust of a small group of riders was just visible. The hunters were here. The chase had begun. The air grew thick with tension. The sheriff's warning had changed everything. They were no longer simply hiding, they were being hunted. Thomas quickly gave orders to his men. "Take up positions. Get the boy inside the cabin. He stays out of sight." Ethan, understanding the gravity of the situation, ran to the cabin and slipped inside without a word. The wranglers, all loyal to Thomas, took up defensive positions behind rocks and in the sparse bushes, their rifles at the ready. The San Fernando Ranch, with its remote location and natural defenses, was a perfect place for a stand, but Thomas knew that they were outnumbered. "What do you want to do, Thomas?" the sheriff asked, drawing his own rifle. These men, they ain't cowboys. They're mercenaries, professionals. They're here for that boy. We stand our ground, Thomas said, his voice hard. This is my land, and that boy is under my protection. The sheriff nodded, a look of grim determination on his face. He'd known Thomas for years, and knew the man was as stubborn as a mule and as fierce as a grizzly bear when pushed. The riders approached slowly, a small group of 6 men. They were the 3 from the saloon, plus 3 more, all of them armed with powerful rifles and a cold, professional air. The man with the pointed face, the one who had spoken in the saloon, rode at the front. He stopped his horse just out of rifle range. "Thomas Grant," he yelled, his voice echoing across the quiet landscape. "We know you have the boy. We saw you leave. We will not harm you. We only want what belongs to us. Hand him over, and no one gets hurt." "He don't belong to you," Thomas yelled back, his voice raw with fury. "He's just a boy, and he's not going anywhere with the likes of you." The man with the pointed face laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Just a boy? That boy is a key, Thomas Grant. He opens doors for us. We will not leave without him. Don't be a fool. You're a rich man. We have no quarrel with you. Just step aside." "Get off my land!" Thomas roared, raising his rifle. The men from the saloon returned fire, and the arid air was filled with the crackle of gunfire. Thomas and his men ducked for cover. The mercenaries were skilled shots, and their bullets chipped away at the rocks and the side of the cabin. Thomas fired back, his aim true, and one of the men on the far right cried out, falling from his horse. The gunfight was short and brutal. The mercenaries, realizing they were facing a determined and well-armed group, began to retreat. They were here for a prize, not a prolonged war. The man with the pointed face looked at Thomas, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. "This is not over, Grant," he shouted. "We will find you, and we will have what we came for." He and his remaining men galloped off, leaving behind the body of their fallen companion. Thomas and his men watched them go, their chests heaving with adrenaline. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. As the dust settled, Thomas looked at the cabin. The door opened slowly and Ethan emerged, his small face pale. His blue eyes scanned the field, taking in the body of the dead mercenary. He said nothing, but his expression was one of profound sadness and fear. Thomas walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's over for now, son. We're safe." "They won't stop," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "My father said they are like wolves. Once they smell blood, they will follow you to the ends of the earth." Thomas knelt down to be at eye level with him. "Then we'll be ready for 'em. They don't know who they're dealing with. I'm not giving you up, Ethan. Not to them, not to anyone." The boy looked at him, and for the first time, Thomas saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Thomas had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The threat was real and immediate. The mercenaries knew Thomas's face, his ranch, and his determination. They would be back, and they would be better prepared. Thomas realized that this was not just about protecting Ethan. It was about protecting his own legacy. His wealth, his power, his name, they were all tied to this boy now. This was a battle for more than just a child. It was a battle for a principle. They buried the dead mercenary, a grim reminder of the violence and danger that had now entered their lives. The sheriff, after a long and serious talk with Thomas, rode back to town, promising to keep an eye out for any sign of the mercenaries. The peace of the San Fernando ranch was gone, replaced by a constant state of vigilance. The wranglers took turns on watch, their rifles always within reach. Thomas trained his men, all of them ranch hands, not soldiers. They were loyal, but they were no match for trained killers. He knew he needed help. He needed a way to get ahead of the men who were hunting them. He went to the cabin, where Ethan was sitting at the table, his book open in his lap. Thomas sat opposite him. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, "tell me everything. The name of your father's business. Who were these men? What did your father have that they wanted so badly?" Ethan looked at the book, his fingers tracing the elegant script. "My father. He worked for a group, a society of historians and linguists. They helped recover ancient texts. They had found something, a treasure of sorts, not of gold, but of knowledge. My father helped them translate the texts. They were a map to a vast hidden library, a library filled with books in every language you can imagine. My father was the key to this map, and I am his heir. I have a copy of the texts." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled-up piece of parchment, covered in the same strange, beautiful script from his book. Thomas unrolled it. It was a complex and beautiful drawing, not a map of mountains or rivers, but a map of knowledge, of languages, and of history. "These men," Ethan continued, his voice barely a whisper, "they weren't mercenaries. They were part of a criminal organization. They want the library, not for knowledge, but for power. They want to sell the texts to the highest bidder. My father refused to help them. They killed him for it. They think I have the only copy of this map." Thomas looked from the map to the boy's terrified face. The game had changed. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. This was a high-stakes hunt for a treasure that could change the world. And Ethan, this small, innocent boy, was the key. Thomas knew he had to protect him. He had to be smarter than them. He had to be one step ahead. With the threat of the mercenaries looming, Thomas knew they couldn't stay at the San Fernando ranch forever. It was too predictable. The mercenaries were trained to track and hunt, and they would eventually find a way to get past Thomas's men. They needed to disappear, to vanish into the vastness of the country. Thomas decided their only option was to head to a major city, a place where they could get lost in the crowds. The most logical choice was San Francisco, a city teeming with life, where a boy with a unique gift could blend in, and where Thomas had business contacts he could rely on for help. The journey would be long and perilous, but it was their only chance. He gathered his men and explained the plan. "We're not just heading to the city. We're leaving the ranch behind for good. We'll ride west and we won't stop until we reach San Francisco." The men, all loyal, nodded in agreement. They were prepared to follow Thomas to the ends of the earth. Thomas knew he could count on them. The journey was a test of endurance. They rode for weeks across dusty plains, through towering mountains, and across rushing rivers. Ethan, surprisingly, held up well. He was a natural horseman, and his quiet resilience impressed Thomas every day. He spent his time observing the world around him, his mind soaking up the new landscapes and the different types of people they encountered on the road. During their long nights, camped under the stars, Thomas and Ethan would talk. Thomas would tell him stories of the West, of the cattle drives, the gold rush, and the building of the railroads. Ethan, in turn, would share stories of his travels, of the Great Wall of China, the bustling markets of Cairo, and the ancient ruins of Rome. Their stories, from two vastly different worlds, wove together, creating a tapestry of shared understanding and a growing bond. The map, the one Ethan called the linguistic map, became their guiding light. Thomas studied it with a magnifying glass, and Ethan explained its symbols. It wasn't a map of physical locations, but a map of knowledge, with symbols representing different languages, cultural artifacts, and historical societies. The final location, the hidden library, was not marked by a simple X, but by a series of interconnected symbols and phrases in different languages. "My father said we could only find it with the right knowledge," Ethan explained one night, pointing to a series of symbols. "These symbols, they are in an ancient language. We need to find someone who can translate them. They are a riddle, a key to the next clue." Thomas realized the full scope of their predicament. They weren't just running from the mercenaries. They were on a treasure hunt, and Ethan was the only one who could read the map. The mercenaries wouldn't just kill the boy, they'd torture him for the secrets he held. Finally, after a long and difficult journey, they saw the ocean. The sight of the endless blue expanse was a welcome change from the dust and heat of the plains. And in the distance, a city of hills and buildings, bustling with activity, San Francisco. The city was a stark contrast to the quiet life they had left behind. The streets were filled with people from every corner of the globe: Chinese laborers, Irish immigrants, wealthy bankers, and hardened prospectors. The air was filled with the smell of the sea, the sound of 100 different languages, and the clatter of trolleys and horse-drawn carriages. Thomas knew they needed to be discreet. He set up an account with a bank and rented a small, unassuming apartment in a quiet part of the city. His men, loyal to a fault, took up work on the docks, keeping a low profile while staying close by. Their new life was one of caution and anonymity. Ethan, with his natural ability to blend in, was a master of his new environment. He would often listen to people in the streets, a faint smile on his face as he translated their words in his mind. Thomas, with a renewed sense of purpose, began his search. The first clue on the map was a phrase in a rare dead language. Ethan, using his uncanny memory, remembered a name and an old address from one of his father's old notebooks, a professor of ancient languages at a local university. They went to the university, a grand stone building filled with the quiet murmur of scholars and students. Thomas, dressed in his finest clothes, a far cry from his ranch attire, approached the professor's office. The professor, a frail, elderly man named Dr. Alistair Finch, was a kind and unassuming scholar. He was initially hesitant to help them, but when Ethan spoke a few phrases in the dead language, his eyes widened with shock and awe. "Impossible," he gasped. "This is a dialect from the ancient Mesopotamian region. No one has spoken this in centuries. Who are you, boy?" Thomas quickly interjected, explaining the situation without revealing too many details. He told Dr. Finch that the boy was an orphan and that his father, a linguist, had left him with a puzzle that could save his life. Dr. Finch, intrigued and moved by the boy's story, agreed to help. He spent hours poring over the text on the parchment, his old eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is not a map," Dr. Finch said, his voice a low whisper. "It is a key. The phrases on this parchment are not a location, but a code. The words are clues to a specific book, a specific chapter, and a specific phrase within the library itself. The library, it is not a building, Thomas. It is a series of collections, scattered across the world, hidden in plain sight. This map leads to the first collection." Thomas and Ethan listened, their hearts pounding. The professor had given them a new piece of the puzzle. The library was not a single place, but a collection of knowledge hidden in different locations, and the mercenaries were hunting them for the map to the first of many. "The first clue," Dr. Finch said, pointing to a symbol on the parchment. "It leads to a rare book, a manuscript from the Spanish Inquisition. It is located here, in San Francisco, in the private collection of a wealthy collector named Mr. Alaric Thorne." Thomas's mind reeled. They were closer to the first treasure than he had ever imagined. The clues were everywhere, but they needed a specific skill set, Ethan's, to find them. The boy wasn't just a key, he was a living, breathing compass. They had a new target, a new mission, and a new hope. But with a new target came a new danger. The mercenaries were still out there, and they were getting closer. Thomas knew that the hunt for the library was a race against time, and that the stakes were higher than ever. The wealthy collector, Alaric Thorne, was known throughout San Francisco for his eccentricities and his formidable private library. He was a recluse, a man who preferred the company of his books to that of people. Gaining access to his collection would be a monumental challenge. Thomas and Ethan spent the next few days in a meticulous planning process. They couldn't just walk in and ask to see a specific book. Thorne would be suspicious. He had a reputation for being paranoid about his collection's security. They needed a plan that was both clever and discreet. "We can't steal it," Ethan said, his small voice filled with a surprising maturity. "My father always said that knowledge is meant to be shared. We must gain access to it, not take it from its rightful owner." Thomas agreed. A simple robbery would not only be a crime, but would also expose them to the authorities. They needed to find a way to get close to Thorne without arousing suspicion. Thomas, with his experience as a wealthy rancher, realized he could use his status as a way in. He made inquiries through his banking contacts and found that Alaric Thorne was a reclusive but influential man who also had investments in the cattle industry. This was their opening. Thomas sent a formal letter to Thorne, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential partnership in a new cattle venture. He used his impeccable reputation and his known wealth to make the offer sound legitimate. A few days later, a reply arrived. Thorne had agreed to a meeting, but on his terms, at his private residence, a grand fortress-like mansion on a hill overlooking the city. The day of the meeting, Thomas and Ethan were both nervous. Thomas wore his best suit, and Ethan was dressed in new clothes that Bess had bought for him in town. He carried his small satchel, the one that held the map, close to his chest. The Thorn mansion was as intimidating as its owner. They were met by a stern-faced butler who led them into a study that was more like a library. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling in every language imaginable. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather. Alaric Thorn was a thin, frail man with an unnerving intensity in his eyes. He sat behind a large desk, a quill in his hand. "Mr. Grant," he said, his voice dry and raspy, "I do not appreciate interruptions. Your proposal better be worth my time." Thomas, ever the shrewd businessman, launched into his pitch talking about the future of cattle and the potential for new investments. He was a master of his trade, and his words were confident and persuasive. Thorn listened, his eyes flickering from Thomas to the boy who sat silently beside him. "And who is this?" Thorn asked, pointing a bony finger at Ethan. "This is my son, Ethan," Thomas said, a pang of pride in his chest as he used the word. "He's a great lover of books. He has a gift for them." Thorn's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion in them. "A gift? What kind of gift?" "He can read a book in any language and tell you its contents in English," Thomas said, watching Thorn's reaction closely. Thorn scoffed. "Impossible. No child can possess such a skill. It takes a lifetime of study. You are lying, Mr. Grant." It was a risk, but Thomas knew it was their only way in. "Try him," he challenged. "Give him any book in this room. He will tell you what it says." Thorn's eyes gleamed with a cold, competitive fire. He rose from his desk and walked to a section of the library, pulling out a small old book with a leather cover. "This is a manuscript from the Spanish Inquisition," he said, holding it out to Ethan. "It is written in an archaic dialect of Castilian Spanish and contains codes and symbols only a handful of scholars in the world can understand. I doubt your boy can decipher a single page." Ethan took the book and opened it. He scanned the pages with his piercing blue eyes, and for a long moment there was silence in the room. Thorn stood with a smug look on his face, but as the silence stretched, a hint of unease began to creep into his expression. Then Ethan spoke. He began to translate, not just the words, but the archaic phrases, the symbolic language, and the historical context. His voice, though small, filled the room with a sense of wonder. He explained the author's intentions, the hidden meanings, and the subtle cultural references that were lost to time. Thorn's jaw dropped. The smug look on his face had been replaced by one of absolute awe. He listened, rapt, as Ethan spoke, and when the boy finished, the old collector was speechless. I have never seen such a thing," Thorn stammered, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You are a miracle, boy." Thomas smiled, a slow, triumphant smile. He had won. He had an opening. "We are here for a different book, Mr. Thorn," Thomas said now that he had Thorn's trust, one with a specific phrase on page 53. He handed Thorn the parchment with the clues on it. "We need to see a specific book from the Inquisition. It has a phrase written in a rare dialect. The phrase, when translated, will lead us to the next clue." Thorn looked at the parchment, then at Ethan, and then back at the parchment. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding passing through them. "The library," he whispered. "You are seeking the hidden library. Your father. He was a member of the society. I know of it. I had heard rumors of the map." Thorn looked at Thomas with a new appreciation. "You are not here for cattle. You are here to protect the boy, the knowledge he carries. It is a dangerous thing. There are others who seek it, men without morals, who would use it for their own gain." Thomas's heart sank. Thorn knew about the mercenaries. The circle of knowledge was wider than he thought. "I will help you," Thorn said, his voice firm. "The book you seek is on a shelf in the back. I will have a copy of the phrase written for you. But be warned, Mr. Grant. The men who are hunting you, they are relentless. They have been looking for this map for years. They will not stop until they have it." Thomas nodded. He knew. But now, with a new ally and the first clue in their hands, they had a fighting chance. They were not just running anymore, they were fighting back. The collaboration with Alaric Thorn was a game-changer. Thorn, a man obsessed with knowledge, was fascinated by Ethan's ability, and was determined to help them find the hidden library. He provided them with a safe house, a small apartment above a bookstore he owned, and used his vast network of contacts to gather information on the mercenaries. "They are called the Brotherhood of the Serpent," Thorne explained one evening in his study. "They are an ancient criminal organization. They are not after money, Mr. Grant. They are after power, the power to control knowledge. They believe that if they can control what people know, they can control the world." Thomas listened, a grim expression on his face. The stakes had been raised again. This was not a simple chase. It was a battle for the fate of history. "They have spies everywhere," Thorne continued, "in every major city, in every corner of the globe. They will be looking for you, Mr. Grant. They will assume you are here because this is the logical place to find the first clue." Thomas understood. They had to be one step ahead. They had to move faster, be smarter, and trust no one. The new clue from the Inquisition book was a phrase written in a rare dialect of ancient Greek. The phrase was a riddle, a poetic line that spoke of the stone that remembers the beginning and the end. Thorne, with his vast knowledge, quickly identified the clue. "The stone," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It refers to the Rosetta Stone. But the phrase, 'it is not about the stone itself, it is a riddle.' The answer is another book, a historical text that contains a translation of the stone. The book, if I am correct, is in a museum in Boston, the Museum of World History." The next leg of their journey was clear. They had to go to Boston. But getting across the country was a dangerous undertaking, and they couldn't simply take a train or a stagecoach. The Brotherhood was likely watching every port and station. Thomas and Thorne devised a plan. They would travel by sea on a small freighter that was used to transport goods. The journey would be longer, but it would be safer. Thomas paid for their passage, and they prepared to leave. Just before they were set to depart, Thorne's trusted assistant, a scholarly young man named Marcus, approached them. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had been helping Thorne with his research. "Mr. Grant," Marcus said, his voice low and serious, "I must warn you. There are men on the docks who have been asking questions about you. They fit the description of the men you are looking for." Thomas's heart sank. How had they found them so quickly? Had they been betrayed? "How do you know?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "I heard them speaking," Marcus said, his eyes flickering. "They were speaking in a language I recognized, the same language you told me your son speaks, a Russian dialect. They said they knew you would be coming here. They have spies everywhere." Thomas's mind reeled. They were compromised. But how? He had been so careful. His mind went back to the only person who knew their plans, Alaric Thorne. Could the old collector have betrayed them? No, his genuine excitement about the library was too real. It had to be someone else. Then the truth hit him like a physical blow. He had told Marcus, Thorne's assistant, that Ethan spoke Russian. It was a detail only a few people knew. Thomas looked at Marcus, and for the first time, he saw a cold, calculating look in the young man's eyes. The quiet, unassuming scholar was a spy. "You're one of them," Thomas said, his voice filled with cold fury. "You betrayed us." Marcus's polite facade fell away. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Of course, the Brotherhood is everywhere, Mr. Grant, and we have been waiting for the boy. We knew his father would have taught him to follow the clues. We knew he would come here. We knew you would seek help from the most renowned scholar in the city. It was all so predictable." As he spoke, a group of 5 men emerged from the shadows, their rifles at the ready. They were the mercenaries, and they had found their prey. "Do not fight," Marcus said, a sneer on his face. "You cannot win. Give us the boy, and we will let you go." Thomas didn't hesitate. He pulled his gun and fired a shot, hitting a mercenary in the leg. The others returned fire, and the docks became a battlefield. Thomas and his men, caught off guard, fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. "Ethan, run!" Thomas yelled, pushing the boy behind him. "Run, son!" Ethan, his face a mask of terror, didn't hesitate. He took off, running into the maze of warehouses and crates. Thomas and his men put up a desperate fight, covering Ethan's escape. Bullets whizzed past them, and one of Thomas's men fell, a pained cry escaping his lips. Thomas fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but they were no match for the trained killers. He took a shot to the shoulder, the impact sending him reeling. He fell to the ground, his arm a searing pain. He looked up just as Marcus stood over him, a triumphant look on his face. "A pity, Mr. Grant," Marcus said, reloading his gun. "You were so close. But the boy is mine now. The map, the library. It will all belong to the Brotherhood." As Marcus raised his gun to deliver the final blow, a new sound filled the air, the shrill wail of a police siren. The gunshots had alerted the authorities. Marcus cursed and turned to his men. "Get out of here! Now!" They scattered, vanishing into the night as the police swarmed the docks. Thomas, bleeding and in pain, watched them go. He had lost the boy. He had failed. An officer ran to his side. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, trying to help him up. "The boy," Thomas gasped, pushing the officer away. "Did you see a boy? He was running. We have to find him." The officer looked at him, confused. "What boy, sir?" Thomas's heart sank. Ethan was gone. The hunter had become the hunted, and the boy was alone again. He had to find him before the Brotherhood did. The battle was not over. It was just beginning. The night was a whirlwind of chaos and pain. Thomas was taken to a hospital. His shoulder wound a deep, throbbing agony. He insisted on leaving, his mind consumed by a single desperate thought, finding Ethan. He knew the boy was somewhere in the vast, unforgiving city, alone and terrified. He had to find him before the Brotherhood did. He managed to slip out of the hospital, his arm in a sling, and went back to the docks. His men, who had survived the gunfight, were waiting for him. They were a grim, determined group, their faces etched with the pain of their defeat. "He got away, boss," Hank, the foreman, said, his voice filled with regret. "We tried to follow him, but he disappeared into the city. He's like a ghost." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy. Ethan had learned to be a ghost from a young age. He knew how to disappear, how to become invisible in a crowd. It was a skill his father had taught him, a skill that had saved his life before. "We have to find him," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with pain and desperation. "We'll go door to door if we have to. We'll find him." Their search began. They scoured the city, going to every orphanage, every church, every home for lost children. They showed pictures of Ethan, but no one had seen him. The city, with its millions of souls, was a perfect place for a ghost to hide. The Brotherhood was also searching. Thomas's contacts, a few of his loyal men who were now on the streets, reported seeing men who fit the mercenaries' description. They were asking questions, flashing money and showing a picture of the boy. The hunt had become a race against time, a deadly game of cat and mouse. Meanwhile, Ethan was navigating the labyrinthine streets of San Francisco. He was a survivor. His father had taught him not just languages, but a skill set for survival. How to find food, how to find shelter, and how to stay invisible. He slept in abandoned warehouses, ate scraps of food he found in the back of restaurants, and moved only in the shadows. He was terrified, but a small part of him felt a sense of purpose. He was on his own now, a protector of the map, a guardian of his father's legacy. He knew he couldn't go back to Thomas. His presence would only put the man in danger. Thomas had already been shot. Ethan knew he had to protect him by staying away. He would face the Brotherhood on his own. He remembered a phrase his father had taught him, a clue for times of great danger. When all is lost, seek the one who speaks with the voice of the old. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was a clue, a path to the next step. He wandered the streets, his eyes scanning for any sign, any hint. He listened to the voices around him, but no one spoke in a way that resonated with the phrase. He was a small, lost boy in a big, unforgiving city. Back in his safe house, Thomas was a wreck. He was a man used to being in control, a man who could solve any problem with money or power. But this was a different kind of problem. This was a battle against an invisible enemy, and the life of a boy he had come to love was at stake. "Boss," Hank said, a look of grim determination on his face, "we ain't finding him this way. We need to be smarter. We need to think like them." Thomas nodded, his mind a whirlwind of pain and desperation. He knew Hank was right. They had to use their heads, not just their brawn. He had to find a way to lure the Brotherhood out, to force them into the open. He remembered the conversation he had with Thorne about the linguistic map and the clues. The next clue, they had surmised, was in Boston. The Brotherhood would assume that's where they were headed. They would be watching every train and ship headed for the East Coast. Thomas had an idea. He went to the nearest telegraph office and sent a message, a carefully worded, coded message to a contact in Boston. The message was a fake. It was a breadcrumb, a false lead. He knew that the Brotherhood would intercept it, and they would send their men to Boston, believing they were on the right track. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. It would buy them time to find Ethan and time to plan their next move. The Brotherhood would be busy chasing a ghost in Boston, while Thomas and his men would search for a real boy in San Francisco. The game had just changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and Thomas, with a new plan and a grim determination, was ready to play. The search for Ethan was on, and this time he would not fail. The days that followed were a blur of desperation and exhaustion. Thomas and his men, now a small, formidable team of 3, Thomas, Hank, and a wrangler named Silas, scoured the sprawling city of San Francisco. They moved through the labyrinthine streets like shadows, their eyes scanning every alleyway and every face. The city, once a symbol of opportunity, had become a merciless maze. The decoy message Thomas had sent to Boston seemed to have worked. His contacts reported seeing the Brotherhood's men at the train stations and docks, their faces a mask of impatience and frustration. They were looking for a boy who wasn't there. It bought Thomas time, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. The Brotherhood would soon realize their mistake, and their fury would be absolute. Thomas, with a renewed sense of purpose, focused his search on the less traveled parts of the city. He reasoned that a boy who had learned to be a ghost would not seek shelter in a place where people would look for him. He would seek the forgotten places, the abandoned corners of the city. Their search led them to the old Chinese Quarter, a dense, crowded neighborhood filled with the scent of spices and the sound of 100 different dialects. The community was tight-knit and distrustful of outsiders, but Thomas had an idea. He had a small amount of money and a lot of determination. He went to the local tea house, a small, unassuming place that served as a hub for the community. He sat at a table and ordered a cup of tea, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He knew he couldn't just walk in and start asking questions. He had to earn their trust. He found an old man, a scholar with a long white beard, who sat alone reading a book. Thomas approached him and, with a respectful bow, began to speak. "I am a stranger in your land, sir, but I am in need of help. I am looking for a boy, an orphan. He is a good boy, but he is lost." The old man looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary distrust. "We have many lost boys here, stranger. The city is full of them. Why should I help you?" Thomas knew he had to be honest, at least in part. He pulled out a small leather pouch and placed it on the table. It was filled with gold coins. "This is not a bribe, sir. It is a sign of my sincerity. The boy, he speaks your language. I believe he may have sought refuge here." The old man's eyes widened slightly. "He speaks our language." "Not just your language, but many," Thomas said, his voice low. "He is a prodigy, a treasure, and there are men who are hunting him, men who want to use him for their own gain. I have promised to protect him, and I will not rest until I find him." The old man looked at Thomas for a long moment, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. He had seen men like Thomas before, men who fought for a cause, for a principle. He had also seen the men who hunted them. He took a sip of his tea and nodded slowly. "I have heard of such a boy, a ghost. He comes and goes, a small shadow with eyes as blue as the sea. He has been seen in the shadows listening, but no one has spoken to him." Thomas's heart leaped. He was here. Ethan was in the Chinese Quarter. "Where?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with urgency. "Where can I find him?" The old man shook his head. "A ghost cannot be found. A ghost must reveal itself, but I will tell you this. There is a place, an old library. It is filled with books from our land. The boy has been seen there." A library. Of course, Ethan, a lover of books, would seek out the one place that felt like home. "Where is this library?" Thomas asked. The old man took out a small piece of paper and drew a map, a series of crisscrossing lines and symbols that were incomprehensible to Thomas. "This will lead you to the library, but be warned. The library is a sanctuary, it is a place of peace. Do not bring violence to its door." Thomas thanked the old man, and with the map in his hand, he and his men set off. The map led them through a series of narrow, twisting alleys until they came to a small, unassuming door. It was a bookstore, but not like any Thomas had ever seen. The shelves were filled with ancient yellowed scrolls and books with strange, beautiful characters on their spines. As they entered, a young boy with a pale face and piercing blue eyes looked up from a book he was reading. It was Ethan. Thomas's heart soared. He was alive. He was safe. "Ethan," Thomas said, his voice a low, emotional whisper. The boy's eyes widened with a mix of fear and relief. He saw Thomas, and then he saw the sling on his arm, his face filled with guilt. "I am sorry," Ethan said, his voice filled with regret. "I ran. I was afraid." "You did the right thing, son," Thomas said, walking over to him. "You saved yourself, and you bought us time. I'm just glad you're safe." He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and a silent promise. The boy leaned into his touch, a small, weary sigh escaping his lips. He was no longer alone. He had found his protector and his family. The glimmer of hope that had flickered in Thomas's heart had now ignited into a burning flame. They were a team again, and together they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. Reunited and relieved, Thomas and Ethan left the quiet sanctuary of the Chinese library. Thomas had a serious talk with Ethan, explaining the danger they were in and the need for absolute secrecy. He told him about the Brotherhood of the Serpent and the high-stakes game they were playing. Ethan, with a wisdom far beyond his years, understood. He showed Thomas the book he had been reading, a thick ancient text written in Mandarin Chinese. "This is it," he said, pointing to a small, elegant character on one of the pages. "The old man who helped me, he told me it was a symbol of strength and wisdom. The next clue is hidden in this book." The book was filled with poetry and philosophical texts. Ethan, with his incredible memory, began to read it, translating as he went. He read for hours, his voice a low, steady murmur. Thomas and his men listened, mesmerized by the ancient wisdom and the beautiful words. Finally, after a long and intense search, Ethan's eyes landed on a specific phrase. He gasped, his eyes wide with recognition. "This is it," he said, pointing to a small line of text. "It's a line from a famous poem. It says, 'The light of wisdom is a golden thread woven through the tapestry of time. It leads to the city where the bells toll for a new beginning.'" Thomas's mind raced. He had a new clue and a new destination. "The city where the bells toll for a new beginning," he mused. "That sounds like a place with a strong historical significance, a place of revolution or a new era." "Boston," Hank said, a look of realization on his face. "The Boston Tea Party, the American Revolution. It was the beginning of a new nation. The bells of the city tolled for a new beginning. It has to be Boston, boss." Thomas nodded in agreement. The clue pointed to Boston, but they had already sent the Brotherhood on a wild goose chase there. This was an opportunity. The Brotherhood would be searching for a boy and his protector, but they would be looking for them in a different part of the city. Thomas knew they had to be even more careful. He and his men, now reunited with Ethan, made their way back to the safe house provided by Alaric Thorne. Thorne, a man who respected knowledge above all else, was overjoyed to see Ethan safe. He immediately began to make preparations for their journey to Boston. "You must take a different route," Thorne advised. "The Brotherhood will have every major port and train station under surveillance. You must go by land. A long journey, but a safer one." Thomas agreed. A long journey by land would be slow, but it would give them an opportunity to stay off the grid, to move under the radar. He used his wealth to buy a large covered wagon and 2 sturdy horses. He stocked it with food, water, and ammunition. It was a long road ahead, but they were prepared. The team now consisted of Thomas, Hank, Silas, and Ethan. They were a small but determined group. They left San Francisco under the cover of night, a small, unassuming wagon disappearing into the vastness of the American landscape. The journey was long and arduous. They traveled through the stunning landscapes of the American West, through vast deserts and towering mountains. Ethan, ever the resilient boy, was a constant source of inspiration. He would sit in the wagon, reading from his books, his small voice translating ancient texts and stories from faraway lands. He was a living testament to the power of knowledge, and a constant reminder of the prize they were fighting for. They had many close calls. They narrowly avoided a group of bandits, and they had to hide from a group of men who were clearly not cowboys. Thomas's instincts were sharp, and he knew they were being watched. The Brotherhood was relentless, and they were getting closer. One afternoon, as they were camping by a river, Thomas and Ethan sat by the fire, a new kind of trust and bond forged between them. "Your father." "He was a brave man," Thomas said, his voice low. "To dedicate his life to a treasure of knowledge, it is a beautiful thing." Ethan looked at him, his blue eyes filled with a newfound respect. "He was a good man. He always said that the greatest treasure is not gold, but the knowledge that connects us all. He said that knowledge is the light that can guide us out of the darkness." Thomas nodded. The boy's words resonated with him. He had spent his life chasing a different kind of treasure, land and wealth. But he was beginning to realize that the greatest treasure of all was right beside him. As they continued their journey, a new layer of the story began to unfold. They were no longer just running from a threat. They were on a mission, a quest. The hidden library was no longer just a destination. It was a symbol of hope, a beacon of knowledge in a world of darkness. And Thomas, a simple rancher, had been tasked with protecting it. They were getting closer to Boston, and with every mile they traveled, a new sense of purpose and a new sense of danger filled the air. The next clue, the next piece of the puzzle, was waiting for them. But so were the men who wanted to take it from them. The final act of their journey was about to begin, and it would be the most perilous one yet. Upon their arrival in Boston, Thomas, Ethan, and their two loyal men were met with a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble West. The city was a place of old stone buildings, cobblestone streets, and a tangible sense of history. They rented a small, discreet house on the outskirts of the city and began their search for the Museum of World History. The museum was a grand, imposing structure, a testament to the city's reverence for the past. It was filled with artifacts from every corner of the globe. Thomas knew they couldn't just walk in and ask to see a specific book. They had to be discreet. He used his wealth to become a patron of the museum, donating a large sum of money and using the opportunity to get close to the curator, a kind but reserved man named Dr. Harold Davies. Thomas told him a similar story, that he was a wealthy benefactor and that his son Ethan had a gift for languages and was interested in a specific text. Dr. Davies, a man who respected knowledge above all else, was intrigued. He took them on a private tour of the museum, showing them the most rare and ancient artifacts. When they came to a small, unassuming room filled with ancient texts, Thomas's heart began to race. "This is our collection of ancient texts," Dr. Davies said, his voice filled with pride. "We have texts from every major civilization in history." Ethan, with his blue eyes wide with awe, walked to a glass case and looked at a small, unassuming clay tablet. "That's not just a tablet," he said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "That's the beginning of a story, a very long story." Dr. Davies's eyes widened. "How did you know that? It's a text from the ancient Sumerian civilization, one of the first known forms of writing." "I know it," Ethan said, a small smile on his face. "My father said it was the first sentence ever written by a human hand. He said it was the most beautiful sentence in the world." Dr. Davies was speechless. He was a scholar of history, and this small, unassuming boy had just told him something he had never known. "Mr. Grant," Dr. Davies said, his voice filled with awe, "your son is a prodigy, a true gift." Thomas seized the moment. "We are looking for a specific text, Doctor, a book from ancient Greece. It contains a translation of the Rosetta Stone. We believe it may be a key to a secret society of linguists." Dr. Davies's face hardened. "The Brotherhood of the Serpent," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I have heard rumors of them. They are a dangerous group. They are not scholars, Mr. Grant. They are criminals." Thomas's heart sank. The web of the Brotherhood was wider than he could have ever imagined. They were everywhere. "We are not with them," Thomas said, his voice firm. "We are trying to find them, to stop them. My son holds the key to the next clue." "Doctor," Davies looked at Ethan, then at Thomas, and then at the ancient clay tablet. He saw the sincerity in their eyes, and he knew they were not lying. He agreed to help them. He led them to a hidden vault, a place filled with the most valuable and secret texts. He pointed to a small, unassuming book. "This is it," he said, "the book you are looking for. It is the only copy in the world." Ethan, with a sense of urgency, opened the book. He turned to the specific page they were looking for, and his eyes widened with recognition. He began to read, his voice a low, steady murmur. The phrase was in ancient Greek, a riddle that spoke of the city of light, where the desert meets the sea, and the whispers of the ancients echo in the wind. Thomas's mind reeled. He knew the answer. It was a clue to a city that was a hub of ancient history and a meeting place of cultures. A city where the desert meets the sea. "Cairo," Thomas said, his voice filled with a newfound hope. "It has to be Cairo." Ethan nodded. "The city of light. My father took me there when I was a child. He said it was a place where all the world's knowledge converged." The next clue was in Cairo. Their next destination was Egypt, a land of ancient secrets and a new, deadly threat. Thomas knew they were getting closer, but he also knew the Brotherhood was getting closer too. They had to move fast, before the Brotherhood realized they were on the wrong trail and changed their course. As they left the museum, a small, dark-faced man with a black fedora watched them from a distance. He had been sent to watch the museum. He had seen Thomas and the boy. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. He knew where they were going. The chase was on, and this time, it was personal. The journey to Boston had been a challenge, but the journey to Cairo would be a life-or-death race across the globe. Thomas, now a seasoned veteran of this dangerous game, made quick plans. They couldn't take a direct ship from Boston. The Brotherhood would be watching. They had to be clever. Dr. Davies, a man of surprising resources, had a friend in the shipping business. He arranged for them to board a small private schooner, a vessel used to transport goods and a few passengers. The schooner was headed to the Mediterranean, and from there they could find a ship to take them to Cairo. The journey by sea was a new experience for all of them. The vast, endless expanse of the ocean was a stark contrast to the endless plains of the West. Ethan, with his natural curiosity, spent his days on the deck watching the waves and listening to the sailors, who spoke in a variety of languages. He was a sponge, soaking up every word, every phrase. Thomas and his men spent their days training. They practiced with their guns and they learned to navigate the ship. Thomas knew that the Brotherhood would not give up. They would find a way to track them. One afternoon, as they were in the middle of the Atlantic, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was a large, fast vessel, and it was heading straight for them. Thomas, with a sense of dread, went to the captain. "That ship," Thomas said, his voice filled with urgency. "It's following us. It's the Brotherhood." The captain, a burly, no-nonsense man, looked through his telescope. He saw the ship's flag, a black flag with a coiled serpent on it. His face paled. "The serpent," he said, his voice filled with fear. "They are the most feared pirates on the sea. They are ruthless." Thomas's heart sank. The Brotherhood had not given up on the sea. They were still here, still hunting. "We have to fight," Thomas said, his hand on his gun. "We can't outrun them." The captain shook his head. "We don't have enough men. We are a small cargo ship. They are a war vessel. They will sink us." Thomas looked at the approaching ship, his mind racing. He had to save Ethan. He had to get him off this ship and away from these men. He went to Ethan and his men. "They're here," Thomas said, his voice low and serious. "We have to get off this ship, now." He told them his plan. He would use the ship's small life raft to get to a nearby island. They would hide there until the Brotherhood passed, and then they would find a way to get back on the sea. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. They lowered the life raft, and with a sense of urgency, they climbed aboard. They left the ship just as the Brotherhood's ship was approaching. They rowed for a small rocky island in the distance. The Brotherhood ship, seeing their escape, opened fire. Bullets whizzed past them. and a few hit the life raft, but they were able to make it to the shore. They watched from a distance as the Brotherhood's ship approached the schooner. The ship's crew, outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered. The Brotherhood's men, led by a man in a black coat, boarded the ship. They were looking for them. They searched every corner of the ship, but they didn't find them. The man in the black coat, a figure who radiated a cold, cruel authority, looked at the captain. "Where is the boy?" he asked, his voice filled with a dangerous calm. The captain, a man who had seen many things, was not afraid of these men. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice filled with a defiant pride. The man in the black coat smiled, a cruel, cold smile. He raised his gun and fired a shot. The captain fell, a lifeless heap on the deck. "He's not here," the man in the black coat said to his men. "He's gone. We'll find him. He cannot escape us. We will hunt him to the ends of the earth." Thomas, watching from the island, felt a cold knot in his stomach. The man's words were not a threat. They were a promise. The Brotherhood was relentless, and they were willing to kill to get what they wanted. They were stranded on a small uninhabited island in the middle of the Atlantic. They had a small amount of food and water, but they had to find a way to get back to the mainland. They were a small, isolated group in a vast and dangerous world. The pursuit had just gotten a lot more dangerous. Their time on the island was a test of survival. They rationed their food and water, and they built a small shelter from the elements. Ethan, with his knowledge of different cultures, was a source of comfort and a beacon of hope. He would tell them stories from his travels, stories of different people and different ways of life. He was a reminder of the world they were fighting for, a world of knowledge and beauty. After a week, a small fishing boat appeared on the horizon. The fisherman, a kind-hearted man who spoke a broken English, was a welcome sight. He was on his way to a nearby port, and he agreed to take them. They arrived at the port, a small, dusty town on the coast of North Africa. They were in a different world now, a world of desert, sand, and ancient history. Thomas knew they were close to Cairo, but they had to be careful. The Brotherhood would be looking for them. They bought a small, sturdy camel and a few supplies. They would travel by land through the desert to reach Cairo. The journey was a new kind of challenge. The heat was relentless, and the landscape was a vast, unforgiving expanse of sand dunes. Ethan, with his knowledge of desert survival, was their guide. He knew how to read the stars, how to find water, and how to navigate the treacherous sands. He was a different person in the desert, a boy who was no longer afraid, but a master of his environment. He was a reminder that he was not just a boy with a gift. He was a survivor. They traveled for days, their journey a slow, methodical march through the endless desert. They had many close calls. They narrowly avoided a group of nomadic bandits, and they had to hide from a sandstorm. One afternoon, as they were resting in the shade of a small rock formation, Thomas looked at Ethan, a deep sense of respect and admiration in his eyes. "You're a brave boy, Ethan," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've been through so much, and you're still fighting. You're a true survivor." Ethan looked at him, his blue eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "My father always said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward in spite of it. He said that a man who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous man in the world." Thomas smiled, a slow, weary smile. He had spent his life building a fortune, but he was beginning to realize that the greatest treasure was not what he had, but what he was fighting for. He was fighting for a boy, for his legacy, and for a world of knowledge. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, they saw it. The city of Cairo, a magnificent, bustling metropolis, a place of ancient history and a new modern world. The city was a blend of cultures, of old and new, and it was the perfect place for them to disappear. They found a small, discreet house in the heart of the city, and they began their search for the next clue. The clue was a riddle that spoke of the echoes of the ancients. Ethan, with his knowledge of ancient Egypt, knew the answer. "The echoes of the ancients," he said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "It refers to the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx is a place of ancient whispers and a guardian of secrets." The next clue was at the Great Sphinx. Thomas and his men, now a small but formidable team, began to make plans. They would go to the Sphinx under the cover of night, and they would be ready for anything. The Brotherhood, they knew, would be close behind. They were now in a new, deadly game of cat and mouse. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fate of the world's knowledge rested on their shoulders. The journey to the Great Sphinx was a silent, tense one. They moved under the cover of night, their small group a single file of shadows in the vast, moonlit desert. The air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the relentless heat of the day. The only sound was the soft padding of their feet on the sand. As they approached the Sphinx, Thomas felt a sense of awe. The Sphinx was a magnificent, imposing structure, a symbol of ancient history and a testament to the power of the human spirit. It stood in the middle of the desert, its stone face a timeless mask of silence and wisdom. Ethan, with a sense of wonder in his eyes, walked to the base of the Sphinx. He reached out and touched the ancient stone, a silent reverence in his movements. "My father said that the Sphinx holds all the secrets of the world," he whispered, his voice filled with a sense of awe. "He said that if you listen carefully, you can hear the whispers of the ancients." Thomas looked at the boy, and he knew that Ethan was not just a boy with a gift. He was a living link to the past, a guardian of a legacy that was older than time itself. "What's the clue, Ethan?" Thomas asked, his voice low and serious. Ethan pulled out the parchment with the clues on it. The clue says, "The echoes of the ancients. Listen to the stone that speaks with the voice of the old." Thomas's mind raced. He knew the Sphinx was a place of riddles, but he had no idea what the clue meant. "It's a riddle," Ethan said, a small, knowing smile on his face. "My father taught me how to read them. It's not about the words. It's about the meaning behind them. The voice of the old refers to the sound of the wind, the sound that has shaped the stone for centuries. The wind. It speaks a language of its own. It's the language of the desert." Thomas was floored. The boy's mind was a well of knowledge, a resource that the Brotherhood would kill for. "We have to find a way to listen to the wind," Thomas said, his mind racing. "We have to find a way to hear the whispers of the ancients." Ethan nodded. He walked to a small, unassuming rock formation near the base of the Sphinx. He knelt down and began to dig in the sand. Thomas and his men watched, their hearts pounding with a sense of urgency. After a few minutes, Ethan pulled out a small old leather box. He opened it, and inside was a small ornate flute. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with a sense of triumph. "The voice of the old. This is a flute that my father made. It is a flute that can be used to listen to the whispers of the wind. It has a hidden message inside." Ethan took out a small, rolled-up piece of parchment from the flute. He opened it, and his eyes widened with recognition. The parchment was filled with a series of musical notes, a complex and beautiful melody that was a language of its own. "This is the next clue," Ethan said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "It's a musical note. It's a key to a specific song. My father said that the song is the next clue." Thomas looked at the musical notes, his mind reeling. The Brotherhood was hunting them, and their next clue was a song. This was a game of wits, of knowledge, of a different kind of war. They were getting closer to the hidden library, but they were also getting closer to the final showdown. The Brotherhood would be close behind, and this time, they would be ready. With the new clue in hand, they made their way back to Cairo. The musical notes, Ethan explained, were a riddle. They had to find a place where they could find a song that would be the key to the next clue. Ethan, with his knowledge of different cultures, knew the answer. "The song," he said, his voice filled with a sense of excitement. "It refers to a place where music is a way of life, a place where the desert meets the sea, and the echoes of the ancient gods still resonate in the air. It's a place called the Symphony of the Sands." Thomas's mind reeled. He had no idea what the Symphony of the Sands was, but he knew they had to find it. They began to ask around, and they soon found a local who knew of the place. It was a small remote oasis, a place where nomadic tribes would gather to sing, to dance, and to tell stories. The journey to the oasis was long and perilous. They traveled through the endless desert, their small group a single file of shadows in the vast, unforgiving expanse. The heat was relentless, and the sandstorms were a constant threat. They were a day away from the oasis when Thomas saw them, the Brotherhood. They were on horseback, A group of 6 men, their dark figures silhouetted against the horizon. They were on their trail. Thomas knew they had to make a stand. They couldn't run forever. They had to lure them into a trap. He and his men, now a small but formidable team, prepared for a fight. He looked at Ethan, his face filled with a grim determination. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and serious, "you have to go on. You have to get to the oasis. You have to find the song. We'll buy you time." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I won't leave you," he said, his voice filled with a defiant pride. "We are a team. We fight together." Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "I know, son. But this is a fight you can't be a part of. We have to protect you. We have to protect the map. Now go." Ethan, with a heavy heart, grabbed his satchel and ran. He ran into the desert, a small, solitary figure in the vast, endless landscape. Thomas and his men, now a small but determined group, waited. They set up a defensive position, and they prepared for a fight. They were outnumbered, and they knew it was a fight they couldn't win. But they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for a boy, for his legacy, and for a world of knowledge. The Brotherhood's men approached, their faces a mask of cruel, cold determination. They saw Thomas and his men, and they knew they had them. They dismounted and prepared for a fight. The gunfight was short and brutal. The sound of gunfire echoed across the silent desert. Thomas and his men fought bravely, but they were no match for the Brotherhood's trained killers. Hank was hit, a pained cry escaping his lips. Silas was hit, and he fell to the ground, a lifeless heap. Thomas was shot in the leg, and he fell to the ground, a searing pain coursing through his body. The leader of the Brotherhood, a tall, imposing man with a cold, cruel smile, walked over to Thomas. "Where is the boy, Mr. Grant?" he asked, his voice filled with a dangerous calm. "We know you sent him to the oasis. Tell us where he is, and we will make your death quick." Thomas, bleeding and in pain, smiled. "You'll never find him," he said, his voice filled with a defiant pride. "He's a ghost. He's smarter than you'll ever be." The man in the black coat sneered. "We have been hunting him for years, Mr. Grant. We will find him, and when we do, we will make him pay for his father's sins." He raised his gun, and a shot echoed across the silent desert. The Brotherhood had moved on, leaving Thomas's body for the carrion birds. They were on their way to the oasis, certain they would find Ethan there. They had won. They had eliminated their competition, and they were one step closer to the hidden library. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated Ethan. Ethan had been hiding behind a small sand dune, watching the battle unfold. He had seen Thomas fall, and his heart had shattered into a million pieces. He had been so close to his new family, to the man who had protected him, and now he was gone. His grief was a fire, a burning rage that consumed him. He was no longer a boy who was afraid. He was a man with a purpose. He had to finish what Thomas had started. He had to find the song. He made his way to the oasis, a lush green paradise in the middle of the unforgiving desert. The oasis was a place of music, of dance, of stories. He saw people from different tribes speaking in 100 different languages. He was home. He went to the center of the oasis, to a place where a group of musicians were playing. They were playing a beautiful melodic song, a song that spoke of love, loss, and hope. Ethan listened, his heart pounding in his chest. He took out the musical notes from his satchel, and he knew. The song they were playing was the one on the parchment. He walked up to the musicians, and with a small bow he began to sing. His voice, once small and timid, was now filled with a newfound strength and confidence. He sang in a beautiful, melodic voice, his voice a blend of every language he had ever spoken. He sang about the loss of his family, about the man who had protected him, and about the hope for a new beginning. The musicians were mesmerized. They had never heard such a beautiful voice, such a beautiful song. They were a part of something bigger than themselves. When he finished, the musicians were in tears. They had heard a story that was more than just a song. They had heard a story of a boy who had lost everything, but who had found a new family and a new purpose. The leader of the musicians, an old man with a kind face, walked over to him. "You are the one," he said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "We have been waiting for you. We have been waiting for the song. The song is the key to the next clue." He pulled out a small old map, a map that was filled with musical notes and symbols. "The song," he said, "is a map to a hidden library. A library in the heart of the desert. A library that has been waiting for you." Ethan's heart leaped with a newfound hope. He had found the next clue. He was one step closer to the hidden library. He was one step closer to fulfilling his father's legacy. He knew that the Brotherhood would be close behind. But he was not afraid. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a mission. He would find the hidden library, and he would protect its knowledge from the men who would use it for their own gain. Ethan, with the new map in his hand, made his way to the heart of the desert. The map was a guide, a silent whisper in the vast, unforgiving expanse of sand and rock. He was on his own now, a small, solitary figure in a vast, empty world. But he was not afraid. He was a man with a purpose, a man on a mission. He walked for days, his mind focused on a single thought, fulfilling his father's legacy. He was no longer a boy who was running. He was a man who was fighting. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, he saw it. A magnificent, imposing structure, a fortress carved out of the rock. It was the hidden library. It was a place of ancient wisdom and a place of new beginnings. It was the place he had been searching for his entire life. As he approached the entrance, a voice filled the air, a cold, cruel voice that he had heard before. It was the voice of the leader of the Brotherhood. "So? The ghost has returned," the leader said, a sneer on his face. "We knew you would come here. We have been waiting for you." Ethan looked at the man, his eyes filled with a newfound courage. "You'll never have the library," he said, his voice filled with a defiant pride. "You'll never have the knowledge." The leader of the Brotherhood laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "You are just a boy," he said. "You cannot fight us. We have been waiting for this moment for years. The library will be ours, and we will control the world." Ethan looked at the man, and a thought, a brilliant, beautiful thought came to his mind. He was a boy, yes, but he was a boy with a gift. He was a boy who could speak 100 different languages. He was a boy who could read 100 different minds. He closed his eyes and he began to speak. He spoke in 100 different languages, a low melodic murmur that filled the air. He spoke in a voice that was not his own. He spoke in the voice of the ancients, in the voice of the desert, in the voice of the wind. The leader of the Brotherhood and his men, caught off guard, were confused. They heard a voice they did not understand, a voice that was both ancient and new. It was a voice that spoke to their deepest fears and their darkest desires. They were a group of men who were used to fighting with their guns, but they were no match for a boy who could fight with his words. They were a group of men who were used to controlling with their fists, but they were no match for a boy who could control with his mind. They were in a state of confusion, and in that moment Ethan seized the opportunity. He ran. He ran into the library, and he locked the doors behind him. He was safe. He was home. The Brotherhood, confused and defeated, left. They had been outsmarted by a boy. They had been outwitted by a ghost. They had been defeated by a whisper. Ethan was alone, but he was not alone. He was surrounded by a world of knowledge, by a world of books, by a world of wisdom. He was a ghost who had found a home, a boy who had found his purpose. He was a man who had fulfilled his father's legacy. The hidden library was not a place of grand halls and towering shelves, but a vast, sprawling labyrinth carved into the rock. It was a silent testament to the countless generations who had dedicated their lives to the preservation of knowledge. Ethan, now alone but no longer afraid, felt a profound sense of awe and responsibility. The entrance sealed behind him, he walked into a world of ancient whispers, where every wall, every scroll, and every book held a story waiting to be told. The air was cool and dry, a perfect sanctuary for the brittle pages and delicate parchments that lined the corridors. The light came from a series of cleverly designed air shafts that filtered the desert sun, creating a soft golden glow. The library was a maze of alcoves, each dedicated to a different culture, a different language, a different time. Ethan, with his unique gift, could read them all. He was a master key in a lock made of history. He spent the first few days simply exploring, his heart a mixture of grief and wonder. He found texts in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in ancient Hebrew, in languages that had been dead for millennia. He found books on astronomy from ancient Babylon, on medicine from ancient China, on philosophy from ancient Greece. This was not a collection of books. It was a record of humanity's shared journey, a tapestry woven with the threads of every civilization that had ever existed. But amidst the awe, there was a sense of purpose. He was here for a reason. His father had taught him not just to read the past, but to live for the future. He had a mission, a promise to keep. The library was a treasure, but it was also a burden. It was the prize the Brotherhood of the Serpent so desperately wanted, and he was the only one who could protect it. He found a small personal study, a place that felt like his father's. There were maps on the walls, not of countries, but of ideas, notes on language, on history, on the connections between cultures. And on a small worn desk, a single journal. It was his father's journal, written in a language only Ethan could understand, a mix of all the languages he had ever taught him. He opened the journal and began to read. His father's words were a comforting presence, a ghost in the machine. He wrote about his life, his travels, his love for his family, and his dedication to the library. He wrote about the Brotherhood, their sinister goals, and their relentless pursuit. He wrote about his plan to protect the library and about the final, most dangerous task. "My son," the journal read, "if you are reading this, I have failed. But you must not. The library is not a place to hide, it is a place to fight. The final clue, the final key, is not in a book or a scroll. It is in the heart of the library itself. You must find it, and you must use it to bring this knowledge to the world. You must fulfill the dream. You must open the library to all." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His father had not intended for him to hide. He had intended for him to act. The library was not a vault. It was a seed, a source of light that was meant to be shared with the world. He read on, and his father's words led him to a secret chamber, a place hidden behind a wall of ancient stone. The chamber was small and unassuming, and in the center of the room, on a small stone pedestal, was a single ancient scroll. It was not a map or a clue, but a record. It was the complete history of the Brotherhood of the Serpent, their members, their goals, and their every move. It was the key to their destruction. Ethan took the scroll, a silent resolve settling in his heart. This was the final piece of the puzzle. This was the weapon he needed to defeat the Brotherhood. He was no longer a boy running from a threat. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a weapon, and a man who would avenge the death of his family and the man who had protected him. The fight was not over. It was just beginning. The Brotherhood, humiliated by a boy and a mysterious voice, retreated from the library, their pride bruised and their confidence shaken. The leader, a man who had never known defeat, was a whirlwind of rage. He had lost the boy and he had lost the library. He had been outsmarted, and he would not rest until he had his revenge. He and his men, now a small but formidable force, returned to Cairo. They would not leave this land until they had their prize. They would find the boy and they would make him pay. They would use their network of spies and informants to search every corner of the city, and they would not stop until they found him. But they were not looking for a boy who was running. They were looking for a boy who was fighting. Ethan, with the scroll in his hand, made his way out of the library, his heart filled with a new purpose. He was no longer a ghost. He was a warrior. He was a man on a mission. He had to bring the scroll to the world, to expose the Brotherhood for what they were, and to bring them down once and for all. He had no idea how he would do it. He was just a boy, and they were a powerful global organization. But he was a boy who had a secret weapon, knowledge. He went to the local tea house in Cairo, the same one where his father had taken him years ago. He found the old man, the one who had helped him before. The man was a scholar, a man who respected knowledge above all else. Ethan knew he could trust him. "I need your help," Ethan said, his voice low and serious. "I have found the library, and I have found the key to the Brotherhood's destruction. But I am just a boy. I need a man who can help me. I need a man who can fight for me." The old man looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary wisdom. "You have found a dangerous thing, my son," he said. "The Brotherhood is everywhere. They will not rest until they have you." "I know," Ethan said, "but I have to do this. I have to finish what my father started. I have to protect the knowledge. I have to avenge the death of the man who protected me." The old man looked at him, and he saw not a boy, but a warrior. He saw a man who had lost everything, but who had found a purpose. He saw a man who was fighting for a cause that was bigger than himself. "I will help you," the old man said, "but we cannot do this alone. We need help. We need a man with influence, a man with power. We need a man who can fight them on their own terms." Ethan's mind went to the one man who had ever truly fought for him, the man who had treated him like his own son. He thought of Thomas Grant. He had to find him, but he had left him for dead. Was he still alive? Was he still fighting? He had to know. He used the old man's contacts to send a message, a carefully worded coded message to his old ranch in Texas. He knew that if Thomas was alive, he would get the message, and he would come. The message was a simple one, a phrase that only they would understand. "The ghost has returned. The library is open." He waited. He knew that the Brotherhood would be close behind. But he had a plan. He was no longer a ghost who was running. He was a ghost who was waiting. He was a ghost who was fighting. And he was not alone. Back on the battlefield in the desert, a lone figure lay motionless in the sand. Thomas Grant, shot in the leg and left for dead, was a man on the brink of death. The sun, a relentless orb of fire, beat down on him, and the sand, once a comforting presence, was now a harsh, unforgiving ground. But Thomas was not dead. He was a survivor. He was a rancher from Texas, a man who had faced death before and had lived to tell the tale. He was found by a small group of nomadic traders, men who were as at home in the desert as Thomas was on the plains. They took him to their camp and nursed him back to health. They were a kind, compassionate group, and they saw not a dying man, but a man who was fighting for his life. As he recovered, Thomas's mind was consumed by a single, burning thought. Ethan. He had failed the boy. He had failed to protect him. He had left him alone to face a world of danger. The pain in his leg was a reminder of his failure, a constant ache that filled him with a newfound purpose. He would not rest until he had found the boy and had avenged the death of his men. One afternoon, a messenger arrived at the camp, a small boy with a look of urgency on his face. He had a message that was not a message, but a sign. He showed Thomas a small old map, a map that was filled with a series of crisscrossing lines and symbols. It was a map that Thomas had seen before. It was a map that only a ghost could draw. Thomas's heart leaped. Ethan was alive. He was safe. The message was not just a message. It was a sign. The ghost had returned. He knew what he had to do. He had to go to Cairo. He had to find the boy. He had to finish what they had started. He gathered his strength, and with the help of the nomads, he made his way to Cairo. He was no longer a wealthy rancher. He was a man on a mission, a man with a purpose. He was a man who was fighting for something bigger than himself. He arrived in Cairo and went to the local tea house, the same one where Ethan had been. He found the old man and he told him his story. The old man listened, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. He saw not a defeated man, but a man who was fighting for a cause. "He is waiting for you," the old man said, his voice filled with a quiet wisdom. "He is waiting for you to fight with him. He is waiting for you to lead him." Thomas nodded. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the boy, and he had to lead him. He had to find a way to fight the Brotherhood, to expose them for what they were. He had no idea how he would do it. He was a man who was used to fighting with his fists, not with his words. But he had a secret weapon. He had a boy who could speak 100 different languages. He had a boy who could read 100 different minds. He had a boy who could fight with his words. And he had a new vow, a vow of vengeance. He would not rest until he had brought the Brotherhood to its knees. He would not rest until he had avenged the death of his men. He would not rest until he had brought the boy back home. The alliance was formed, a bond of trust and purpose forged in the fires of loss, and a shared vision of a future free from the shadows of a powerful criminal organization. The alliance between Thomas, Ethan, and the network of scholars and informants in Cairo was a powerful one. Thomas, with his business acumen and his formidable influence, and Ethan, with his unparalleled knowledge and his unyielding courage, were a force to be reckoned with. They were a small but formidable team, ready to take on a global criminal organization. Their plan was a grand deception, a masterful plot to lure the Brotherhood into a trap they could not escape. They would use the very thing the Brotherhood wanted, the hidden library, as bait. They began by spreading rumors, carefully curated whispers that floated through the city's underbelly. The whispers spoke of a boy who was searching for the hidden library, of a final clue that was hidden in plain sight. They knew that the Brotherhood's spies would be everywhere, and they knew they would hear the whispers. The whispers spoke of a specific location, a small, unassuming bookstore in the heart of the city. The bookstore, they claimed, was the final clue. It was a place where all the world's knowledge converged, a place where the final piece of the puzzle was hidden. The Brotherhood, arrogant and overconfident, fell for the trap. They sent their most trusted men, their most skilled killers, to the bookstore. They were ready for a fight, a final showdown, a battle for the fate of the world's knowledge. But they were not ready for what they found. The bookstore was not a place of ancient texts and hidden clues. It was a place of new books, of modern literature, of a different kind of knowledge. The books were not in ancient languages, but in 100 different modern tongues. They were not books on history, but on science, on art, on philosophy, on the human spirit. And in the center of the bookstore, on a small, unassuming table, was a single ancient scroll. It was not a scroll of ancient history, but a scroll of modern history. It was the complete history of the Brotherhood of the Serpent, their members, their goals, and their every move. It was the key to their destruction. The leader of the Brotherhood, a man who had never known defeat, was furious. He had been outsmarted by a boy. He had been outwitted by a ghost. He had been defeated by a whisper. He ordered his men to burn the scroll, to destroy the evidence. But as they tried to, a group of men, dressed in simple civilian clothes, appeared from the shadows. They were not soldiers or mercenaries, but scholars, librarians, and historians. They were the men who had been waiting for this moment, the men who had been fighting for the preservation of knowledge for centuries. They were the men who were a part of the network of scholars and informants who had been helping Ethan. They were a small but formidable force, and they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for a cause, for a principle, for the fate of the world's knowledge. A fierce but swift brawl ensued, with the librarians and scholars fighting with a ferocity born of conviction. The Brotherhood's men, caught off guard and facing an enemy they didn't understand, were defeated. The leader of the Brotherhood, a man who had never known defeat, was arrested, his reign of terror over. The Brotherhood of the Serpent was no more. The ghost had won. With the Brotherhood of the Serpent defeated, the world was a safer place. Thomas and Ethan had succeeded. They had protected the hidden library, and they had brought a powerful criminal organization to its knees. But their journey was not over. They had a final task, a final promise to keep. They had to unveil the hidden library to the world. They had to share the knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. They returned to the hidden library, to the vast, sprawling labyrinth carved into the rock. They were not alone this time. They were joined by a group of scholars, historians, and librarians from every corner of the globe. They were the men and women who had dedicated their lives to the preservation of knowledge, and they were ready to take on the task of bringing the library to the world. The unveiling was a grand, spectacular event. The world's media, the world's leaders, the world's scholars, they were all there. They had come to witness a miracle, to witness the opening of a hidden library that had been a myth for centuries. Ethan, with Thomas by his side, stood at the entrance to the library. He was not a boy anymore. He was a man. He was a guardian of a legacy that was older than time itself. He began to speak. He spoke in 100 different languages, a low, melodic murmur that filled the air. He spoke about his journey, about the man who had protected him, about the battle for knowledge, and about the importance of history. He spoke about his father's dream, a dream of a world where all knowledge was shared, where all people were connected. When he finished, the world was silent. They had heard not just a speech, but a promise. They had heard a story that was more than just a story. They had heard a story of a boy who had lost everything, but who had found a new family and a new purpose. The doors to the library were opened, and the world was invited to enter. The scholars, the historians, and the librarians walked in, their faces filled with a sense of awe and wonder. They were no longer just men and women of books. They were a part of a legacy that was a link to the past and a beacon for the future. The hidden library was no longer a myth. It was a reality. And it was a reality that was a testament to the power of a single brave boy and a man who had the courage to protect him. The world was a different place now. It was a place of hope, of knowledge, of a new beginning. And it was all thanks to a ghost who had found his voice. The world celebrated Thomas and Ethan as heroes. They had not only defeated a powerful criminal organization, but had also gifted humanity with the greatest repository of knowledge ever discovered. Thomas, however, was not one for fame or accolades. He returned to his ranch in Texas, the vast silent plains a welcome balm for his soul. He had no desire for a life in the city, no interest in the endless ceremonies and speeches. His work was done, his promise kept. The ranch was different now. The silence was not one of loneliness, but of peace. He had his men, his cattle, and a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a wealthy rancher, he was a guardian of a legacy. Ethan, too, had a new life. He spent his time traveling the world, not as a boy on the run, but as a global ambassador of knowledge. He worked with the scholars from the hidden library, translating ancient texts and helping to digitize the priceless collection so it could be shared with everyone, everywhere. He was a man with a mission, a living bridge between the past and the future. But no matter where his travels took him, he always returned to the ranch. It was his home. It was the place where he had found his voice and where he had found his family. Thomas was always there, waiting for him on the porch, a quiet smile on his face. Their bond was a silent, unbreakable one. They were not father and son by blood, but they were family by choice. They had been forged in the crucible of danger, and they had emerged stronger and more connected than ever before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and red, they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. "You know, son," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, "I never thought I'd find a reason to leave this place, but you gave me one. You gave me a reason to fight." Ethan smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "And you gave me a reason to live, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "You gave me a home." They sat in comfortable silence, their hearts filled with a sense of peace. They had faced a world of danger, and they had emerged victorious. They had fought for a cause, and they had won. They had lost a family, but they had found a new one. Thomas's ranch, once a lonely monument to a life of solitude, was now a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in a world of darkness. It was a testament to the power of a single brave man who had the courage to protect a boy with a gift, and a boy who had the courage to fight for his legacy. The legacy of the rancher was not one of wealth or power, but one of courage, of loyalty, and of a love that was stronger than any challenge the world could throw at them. Years passed. The world changed. The hidden library, now fully accessible to all, became a catalyst for a new age of discovery and understanding. Scholars from every nation collaborated, sharing knowledge, breaking down barriers, and forging new alliances. The legacy of Thomas and Ethan was not just in a book, but in the minds and hearts of people everywhere. Thomas, now an old man, still sat on his porch, his face a map of sun-worn lines, but his eyes held a deep, quiet contentment. He had lived a long and fulfilling life, a life that had been given a second chance by a boy with a gift. Ethan, a man now with the same piercing blue eyes and a quiet, knowing smile, was a celebrated figure. He was a global ambassador of knowledge, a living bridge between cultures. He had fulfilled his father's dream, and he was a man who was fighting for a world of peace and understanding. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how much he achieved, he always returned to the ranch. It was a ritual, a silent promise. He would come home, and he would sit on the porch with Thomas, a quiet moment of peace in a world of chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and red, Thomas looked at Ethan, a deep, quiet love in his eyes. "You know, son," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, "you came to my life like a ghost, and you left a mark on my soul." Ethan smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. He knew what Thomas meant. He was not just a boy he had saved. He was a part of him, a part of his legacy. "And you came to my life like a promise, Thomas," Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "A promise of a home, a promise of a family, a promise of a future." They sat in comfortable silence, their hearts filled with a sense of peace. The journey was over, but the story was not. The story of a wealthy rancher who had found a boy with a gift and a boy who had found a home was a story that would be told for generations to come. It was a story that was a testament to the power of love, of courage, and of a single silent promise that was stronger than any challenge the world could throw at them. The sun set and the stars appeared one by one, a silent, beautiful testament to a journey that had changed the world and to a promise that had lasted a lifetime. The final chapter was not in a book, but in a silent promise, a promise between a man and a boy, a promise of a love that was stronger than 1,000 words.